Hi, my name's Penny, and as usual, I'm here to talk about some bookish things. Specifically, today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I've read in February and telling you my thoughts about those books. I read 11 books in the month of February, some good ones, some not so good ones, and I'm going to talk about them by genre, starting with horror and kind of easing my way towards fantasy. A genre gradient, if you will. So, let's start with the horror that I read, and this was a horror manga that my brother actually got me for Christmas, Fragments of Horror by Junji Ito. So this was creepy and weird, and I absolutely love that kind of thing. It's basically like a short story anthology, and each short story has some strange thing going on. The very first story, there is a couple and the man decides that he's just not going to get out of bed anymore because he can see evil spirits everywhere, and it gets kind of yuck from there. Pretty much every story starts out with this very strange premise and then just gets yuck. My favorite story was probably Blackbird, where there is a guy who breaks his legs and then regularly has this bird woman delivering him meat, and that's how he manages to survive out there in the middle of nowhere. But then eventually you find out where that meat was coming from, and it's gross. There's also a really great story where this girl isn't able to make any decisions for herself, like, should I continue holding up this book or not? Should I keep filming? What should I say? I don't know. She can't make any decisions herself, even the most simple, so they basically have this woman hired to make all her decisions for her, and she's constantly whispering in her ear, and it's creepy what happens to her. So in total there are 8 stories. There's one about a woman who has very intense feelings for a house. There's one where a man has his head coming off. There's one where there's a family and they're able to keep the ghosts of their family around. There's a woman who really likes being dissected. There is this famous author who lures people towards her for some nefarious means. And there's the Whispering Woman, which is that one where the girl can't make any decisions. Anyway, I think that if you like manga and you like things that are like a little bit weird and creepy, you would absolutely love this. I know that I did, so you should try and read it. Then I also did read a couple of mystery thrillers. The thriller I read was The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins. So this is a story about a woman on a train, not really a girl, a woman on a train who every day catches a train back and forth. And each chapter is basically set up between morning and evening, her morning trip on the train and her evening trip on the train. And every day the train tends to break down in this one particular spot, and she often sees this other couple out on their deck, and she builds up this big fantasy in her head about what these people are like. Then one day, when she's going past, she sees something very strange going on at their house, and she gets kind of wrapped into this undesirable situation. I did enjoy the mystery of this. However, there are actually 3 different women's perspectives throughout this book, and each one of them is quite dysfunctional, and they make a lot of bad decisions. And by halfway through the book, I was quite sick of them making so many bad decisions all the time and just making things worse and worse for themselves. There were definitely some other people who did some bad things, and so not everything was within these women's control, but they definitely did some really not smart things. And it got a bit boring to read about, but I did like the mystery. I figured it out just a bit before it got revealed, which I feel like is the perfect time to be figuring out the mystery. I did feel like the ending kind of felt a bit rushed, and that's where there kind of was quite a lot of action. Once the mystery was revealed, I really didn't care about what happened after that. So that could just be me and the fact that I like trying to figure out the mystery. Overall, as far as thrillers go, I did like this one, and I do struggle to find thrillers that I like. I thought this was okay, but at the same time, it wasn't mind-blowing. I would like to watch the film at some point and see how that compares, but overall, 3 stars. It was alright. So then the other mystery thriller I read is a YA mystery. I think it's a little bit of a stretch to call it a thriller, although there are some thrilling moments, especially at the end, which is how thrillers tend to do it. So what I'm talking about is The Hand on the Wall by Maureen Johnson. This is the third and final book in the truly Devious series, which is all about this girl named Stevie who goes to this school for gifted students, and each student has a specialty that they're interested in. And Stevie, our main character, is really interested in true crime, and she's hoping to solve the case of the kidnapping and the murder that happened at the school 50 years ago. And the story is told interlacing chapters in the present time where Stevie's trying to solve the murder, and also things happening 50 years ago that kind of reveal what was actually happening. I thought this book did a really great job at wrapping up the series. All the loose ends were tied up, there was still a lot of mysteries floating around, and we got some resolution to all of those things. And overall, I just really enjoyed the reading experience. I do think sometimes, because so many people rave about this series, that people get the wrong idea about it. It's not really that thrilling. It's more just fun and clever. There's some really great humor in it, which if you follow Maureen Johnson on Twitter, you will not be surprised by. And in the end, I just had to give this 5 stars because I thought that it wrapped up the series so well. I don't necessarily think this series is an amazing piece of literature, but I do think it's a really good mystery and a lot of fun, and I'd really recommend you read it if you think YA mystery thrillers are something you would enjoy. Also, this book does have really good anxiety representation, so that's another good thing about this book. Then I also read 2 YA science fictions. Firstly, I read The Knowing by Sharon Cameron. This is the sequel to The Forgetting. In The Forgetting, people regularly, every 12 years, forget everything, and they have to carry around these little books where they note down everything about their life so that when they wake up after one of these forgettings, they can remember what's going on. But of course, that system of remembering things is very open to corruption, so there's a lot of problems. There's a bit at the end where they discover some things, which is what makes this series science fiction. Hopefully there's not too many spoilers. The second book, I was expecting to continue on directly from that with the same characters. However, instead it was set quite far in the future. I suspect hundreds of years, although I never quite confirmed that. Now we have the elites of the society living underground, and they are called the Knowing because they are not able to forget anything, which it's really interesting how it explores how not being able to affect anything affects you emotionally. Most of the characters are very traumatized. There's a lot of suicide, so that's probably something to watch out for with this book. And then at the same time as following this girl from the Knowing, we're also following a guy who's arriving from Earth, who has been looking for these people that set out from Earth a long time ago. And now they've found them, but they kind of connect in a strange way. And what I have to say, I guess, is that I enjoyed the concepts of this and the way it explored them. I thought it was a really great contrast with The Forgetting, looking at the similarity and the differences that Forgetting and Knowing both caused. And at the end, things were quite action-packed and there were a lot of twists and turns. But the big middle of the book was all about these 2 characters building their relationship, and I really just couldn't care less about those characters' relationships. If YA relationships in sci-fi are something you are on board with, you might not mind that part of the book, but yeah. The middle part of the book just wasn't for me, so in the end, because it spent so much time on those relationships rather than exploring the really interesting concepts, I had to give it 2 stars. The other YA sci-fi that I did read in the month of February was Starsight by Brandon Sanderson. So this is the second book in the trilogy. I'm not sure what the trilogy is called. I think it's just called the Skyward trilogy. So we follow a girl named Spencer who really wants to become a fighter pilot and protect her people from the aliens that are always attacking them. They live on this rock planet with not much on it, and they live underground so that they're not getting attacked by these aliens. Unfortunately, Spencer's father ran away in the middle of this big important battle, and ever since then that has really left her family with a reputation of being cowards, so she really has to fight for her position. There are some things that are revealed at the end of the first book that means the second book goes in a very different direction. And like, I don't want to give the impression that I didn't enjoy this book. I thought it had a lot of really great parts to it, but I guess I just didn't enjoy it as much as the first book. I'm pretty sure I gave the first book 5 stars. The second one, I gave it 3.5. I did give it that 0.5 because I didn't think that it was just a 3, but I also didn't quite feel right giving it a 4, so 3.5 is what we're giving it. I just think that the characters weren't quite as believable and developed, especially there were certain people in positions of authority, and I just thought their actions seemed very simplified. And there's an argument that these people in authority are from a very different culture from us, so maybe the things they were doing just made more sense in that culture and Brandon Sanderson had developed it fully, but mostly I was just like, these people don't seem like real people. Also, one of the main characters in the series is Mbot, who is an AI spaceship, and in the first book I absolutely loved his humor. In the second book he still had some really funny lines, like he's still definitely my favorite character, but it didn't feel like he was quite as funny. And I think sometimes as well, the plot just seemed quite convoluted in a really unnecessary way. However, I do find like the big bad creatures that are starting to be revealed in this world to be very intriguing. It's a very different kind of creature, and I'm really interested to see what we'll learn about that in the third book and what Brandon Sanderson will do to wrap up the series. So even though I didn't like the second book as much as the first book, I am really hopeful that I'm still going to really love the series. Okay, then I also read 4 fantasies in the month of February. Let's start with the YA one, and that was The Diviners by Libba Bray. Oh, I have this one here. So this I borrowed from my sister quite a while ago. I actually started reading it in January, and then I had to put it aside so that I could finish some library books off in time before I had to return them. But The Diviners. This is a story about primarily a girl named Evie who has the ability that when she's touching things, she can read memories from them. And there are also a bunch of other characters who have other supernatural abilities. And Evie finds herself in New York living with her uncle who lives in this museum of the occult, and he is helping to investigate these murders that have been happening, and Evie somehow gets involved in the murder investigations, even though why you would let someone who I think is like 16, maybe she's 18 at a stretch. Anyway, she's way too young to be included in a murder investigation. She's also just kind of like a socialite brat, always looking for attention. I didn't really like the main character, Evie, and I really don't think anyone would be letting her get involved in a murder investigation in real life. I mean, you could argue that Evie doesn't take no for an answer and that she would just get involved regardless, but really, I just didn't think people would let her get away with the things that they did let her get away with. I also thought there's a lot of time spent developing these other characters with other supernatural powers, but nothing much is really done with any of that. I suspect that it's setting up for things that are going to happen throughout the rest of the 4-book series, but we didn't get any of that in here. It just felt like I was reading a lot of stuff for not really any purpose. Also, the romance in here is kind of yuck. Like when you first meet this character, he's described as being kind of bleh. Like, you know, some other character has a crush on them, and the main character, Evie, is like, oh, he's kind of gross. And I guess it's spoilers, but like, anyway, in the end, she kisses him, and I was like, why would you kiss that guy? He's gross. Remember how you described him as gross? But like, oh, we're both different. And I suspect it's starting up a love triangle with her and that guy and another guy, which I'm not really that into love triangles. Anyway, overall, I thought this book was mostly just set up. I didn't like the characters. I thought the writing was overly descriptive without ever describing the things that actually mattered. I know that a lot of people do really love this book, and I'm really glad that they do, but for me, this just didn't hit the spot. I am going to continue the series, but I'm going to try audiobook because I know that these are really long books. I think they get longer and longer, and there's no way I'll ever get through them in physical form. But I'll try the audiobook, and hopefully the next books in this series will be less set up and I will like them a bit better. Then I also read another well-loved fantasy, and that is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This one I enjoyed a lot more. I listened to it on audiobook, and I would like to reread it in physical form at some point, I think, because I think it would be a very different experience, and I'd almost like to just do a reread and really take my time to enjoy the really descriptive writing style. This is a story that's really hard to describe the plot because for a lot of the book you don't really understand what's going on, but you're on the journey with the characters and you're enjoying the really weird magic that is going on. So it doesn't necessarily matter too much that you don't know what's going on, but I did think sometimes trying to figure out what was going on was distracting me from just enjoying what was happening. Basically, there are two magicians who have been set up by their mentors to be in competition with each other at this night circus. Bit of a romance going on, but most of it is just about people experiencing this really magical circus. I did really enjoy it. I think if you don't like ambiguity and you don't like slow, very lyrical writing, then you probably won't like this. But if you can deal with all of that and you like things that are very magical and unknown, then I think you would really like this book. I also read Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This is another one I think that suffered from being a lot of setup because this is going to be the first book of a series. We have this girl named Alex Stern who is part of this Ninth House at Yale. Ninth House is basically this secret society that polices the other secret societies that are involved in the occult and other kinds of magic. In the beginning of the book, we're jumping back and forth between two timelines, one which is Alex in the current day trying to deal with a murder that's gone on, and another one in the past which is her mentor Darlington and him inducting Alex into this secret society. In the present time, Darlington is missing, so you're kind of wondering how that happened. There's also a very traumatic, mysterious event in Alex's past that she also keeps jumping back to. So I think that part of what made the book struggle to get going in the beginning was just that we kept jumping between these three different timelines. Sometimes in Alex's chapters we would jump back to this traumatic event that had happened to her, or we'd jump back to when she first joined the secret society, the same events that Darlington was describing in his chapters. It was just a lot of jumping back and forth and not much actual progression of what was happening in the here and now. However, once we got about 3/4 of the way through the book, things really came together and got moving, and the ending of the book just left me needing the next book in the series. And I know it's not coming out in 2021, and I'm really annoyed that we have to wait after that ending. But if it had just done that ending and not done any of the exciting stuff at the end, I don't think that would be enough to make me want to read it. But I think Alex is going to be a really great character now that Leigh Bardugo has kind of put her together. I can definitely see why some people have given this book negative reviews and some people have given it really positive reviews. It is the kind of book that not everyone is going to like. And personally, if I was into DNFing, I might have DNF'd it halfway through. However, I pushed through, and in the end I ended up giving it 4 stars because I really enjoyed it. So you never know. Okay, then the last book that I read is A Cathedral of Myth and Bone by Kat Howard. This is a short story anthology. The main story in the middle of the book, which takes up about half of the book, is an Arthur and Camelot retelling, but it's very strange, basically taking people who are sort of reenacting the Arthur myth as part of the university class, and then things get very strange. And basically all of these stories were very strange. They look at different myths and legends and they retell them in a modern setting, but some of the ways that it just looks at the concepts of stories themselves was really interesting. I thought all the characters were very relatable, and I felt engaged straight away, which is really important in a short story because you don't have very long to get engaged with the story. But I think Kat Howard is obviously a very skilled short story writer. Not every author is good at writing short stories. It's very different to writing a novel where you've got a lot of time to fill out the ideas in the story. So in general, I don't end up liking a lot of short story anthologies because it's often a lot of those novel writers writing short stories just to be a part of the short story anthology, whereas this one was Kat Howard really telling stories that you can tell she's very passionate about and cares a lot about. Also, I think just because the stories were all from her, it was a very cohesive anthology. So even though I don't normally like short story anthologies, I ended up really loving this one. Then I also read How to Change Minds, The Art of Influence Without Manipulation by Rob Jolles. So this was a really good audiobook, although it was very short, basically just setting out what is the difference between influence and manipulation, and then talking about how you can really empathize with people and use that to help influence them. I will say that it's narrated, I believe, by the author himself, and he is a salesperson. So it's in some ways from a very sales heavy perspective, although you can easily apply it in non-sales context, and he does explain it in a way that isn't too sales heavy. But because he's a salesperson, he comes across as if he's trying to give a sales pitch of these ideas. So sometimes I just felt like that was a little bit too intense. I'm not a fan of the hard sell, and that probably makes it sound worse than it actually was. But I do think it will put some people off. Overall, I did think there were a lot of really great ideas in this book, and it's probably one that I would recommend to other people. For example, when I'm at work, for people who are looking to make sure that they're not manipulating people when they're influencing people, but also just to figure out better ways of influencing people without being a dick. The other nonfiction book that I listened to this month was Never Get Angry Again, the foolproof way to stay calm and in control in any conversation and situation. So this is by David J. Lieberman. I believe he's a Dr. Lieberman. And in the beginning, I was really loving this book. It was explaining a lot of the psychology behind getting angry, although a lot of it wasn't necessarily very scientific explanations. I still felt personally it made a lot of sense to me, and in terms of what I have experienced myself when I've been angry, and also what I've seen other people doing when they're angry, and just like trying to understand why people act in such an angry way. But the first part of the book was just that, explaining why people get angry. Then the second half was supposed to be where we got to talking about what you can do to stop yourself from getting angry. Unfortunately, the first chapter was just believe in God. Yeah, that's going to stop you from being angry. As someone who is not super religious, I didn't appreciate the fact that that was put out there in such a non-scientific way. And then also a lot of the rest of the advice that was given was pretty much the same advice that's given in The How of Happiness by Sonia Lyubomirsky. Not sure about that surname, but The How of Happiness is a very well-known psychology book about happiness, and there's a lot more science in that. There are some criticisms of the book and the science within it. However, it does have some really good advice for getting your mental state a bit more together. And that book actually has a chapter on spirituality, and it talks about how religion and spirituality can in fact make you happier and therefore less angry. But it does it in a really scientific way that even someone who is not particularly religious doesn't really feel attacked by it or like it isn't relevant to them. This one here was just coming from someone who's obviously completely religious and treats the Bible as fact. And once I heard that, it really made me question all the stuff at the beginning which didn't have that scientific evidence. So it was very sad because in the beginning I was really hopeful that this was going to be a really great and helpful book, but in the end it just made me kind of annoyed. And unfortunately, it's not a book that I could give to anyone I know to help them with their anger issues. So that was a bit of a waste of time. I would definitely recommend that if you're thinking about picking this book up, that instead you pick up The Hell with Happiness, or like there's probably a lot of other books on the same topic that cover the same ideas because they're pretty universal at this point. So I think that I've talked about all the books that I read in February. As I said, there were some books in there that I really enjoyed. The Hand on the Wall, A Cathedral of Myth and Bone, Ninth House, The Night Circus, Fragments of Horror, but unfortunately also a few that were a bit of a disappointment. So it was pretty much half and half, I think, in the end. But never mind, now it's March, so I'm going to move on to my March TBR, which I'm especially excited about. Do let me know if you've read any of the books that I talked about today and what you thought about them, or whether you're interested in picking any of them up. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you're having a really wonderful day, and I will see you next time.